Das Kapital by Karl Marx. This is the complete book of Das Kapital, written by Karl Marx. This episode series presents the entire work in full. It is not a summary and not an audiobook, but the complete book itself. Episode 2. The twofold character of the labor embodied in commodities.
The pivot point of political economy. Marx begins this section by reminding us where we've been and announcing where we're going. He writes, "At first sight, a commodity presented itself to us as a complex of two things, use value and exchange value. Later on, we saw also that labor too possesses the same twofold nature, for so far as it finds expression in value, it does not possess the same characteristics that belong to it as a creator of use values. So just as commodities have two aspects, so does the labor that creates them." And Marx makes a bold claim here. I was the first to point out and to examine critically this twofold nature of the labor contained in commodities. Then he tells us why this matters. As this point is the pivot on which a clear comprehension of political economy turns, we must go more into detail. This is the pivot point, the hinge. Everything in Marx's analysis turns on understanding that labor has two different characters. Setting up the example. Marx gives us a concrete example to work with. Let us take two commodities, such as a coat and 10 yards of linen, and let the former be double the value of the latter, so that, if 10 yards of linen equals W, the coat equals 2W. So we have a coat worth twice as much as 10 yards of linen. Now let's examine the labor that goes into each. Marx starts with the coat. The coat is a use value that satisfies a particular want. Its existence is the result of a special sort of productive activity, the nature of which is determined by its aim, mode of operation, subject, means, and result. Think about what goes into making a coat. You need tailoring, you need specific skills, specific tools, specific materials. You're doing something very particular with a specific goal in mind. Marx defines this kind of labor. The labor whose utility is thus represented by the value in use of its product, or which manifests itself by making its product a use value, we call useful labor. In this connection, we consider only its useful effect. Useful labor is labor considered in terms of its specific, concrete form and its useful result. Tailoring creates coats, weaving creates linen. And here's a key point. As the coat and the linen are two qualitatively different use values, so also are the two forms of labor that produce them, tailoring and weaving. The products are qualitatively different, so the labor must be qualitatively different too. As Marx explains, were these two objects not qualitatively different, not produced respectively by labor of different quality, they could not stand to each other in the relation of commodities. Coats are not exchanged for coats. One use value is not exchanged for another of the same kind. You don't trade a coat for a coat, that would be pointless. You trade a coat for linen, or for shoes, or for bread. You trade different use values, which means you're trading the products of different kinds of labor. The division of labor. This leads Marx to discuss the division of labor. To all the different varieties of values in use, there correspond as many different kinds of useful labor, classified according to the order, genus, species, and variety to which they belong in the social division of labor. Every different kind of useful thing requires a different kind of useful labor, and these different kinds of labor are organized into what we call the division of labor. But Marx makes an important distinction. This division of labor is a necessary condition for the production of commodities, but it does not follow, conversely, that the production of commodities is a necessary condition for the division of labor. Wait, what? You need a division of labor to produce commodities, but you can have a division of labor without producing commodities. How does that work? Marx gives us examples. In the primitive Indian community, there is social division of labor without production of commodities. Or, to take an example nearer home, in every factory the labor is divided according to a system. But this division is not brought about by the operatives mutually exchanging their individual products. In a factory, different workers do different jobs. There's a division of labor. But the workers aren't producing commodities to exchange with each other. They're all working together to produce a product that belongs to the factory owner. So what makes the division of labor lead to commodity production? Only such products can become commodities with regard to each other. as result from different kinds of labor, each kind being carried on independently and for the account of private individuals. It's when each person is working independently, for themselves, that their products become commodities. The key is that the labor is carried on independently and for the account of private individuals. Marx summarizes, in a community, the produce of which in general takes the form of commodities, that is, in a community of commodity producers, this qualitative difference between the useful forms of labor that are carried on independently by individual producers, each on their own account, develops into a complex system, a social division of labor. Useful labor as eternal necessity. Now Marx makes a broader point about useful labor. Whether the coat is worn by the tailor who made it or by a customer who bought it, in either case it operates as a use value. The coat is useful regardless of who uses it. And he notes, nor is the relation between the coat and the labor that produced it altered by the circumstance that tailoring may have become a special trade, an independent branch of the social division of labor. Whether everyone makes their own clothes or there are specialized tailors, doesn't change the fact that making clothes requires specific productive activity. Then Marx zooms out even further. Wherever the want of clothing forced them to it, the human race made clothes for thousands of years without a single man becoming a tailor. People have always needed to make things. And he generalizes, but coats and linen, like every other element of material wealth that is not the spontaneous produce of nature, must invariably owe their existence to a special, productive activity, exercised with a definite aim, an activity that appropriates particular nature-given materials to particular human wants. Everything we make requires some specific form of useful labor, and this leads to a fundamental statement. So far, therefore, as labor is a creator of use value, is useful labor, it is a necessary condition, independent of all forms of society, for the existence of the human race. It is an eternal nature-imposed necessity, without which there can be no material exchanges between man and nature, and therefore no life. Useful labor is an eternal necessity. It doesn't matter what kind of society you have. Capitalist, feudal, socialist, whatever. Humans need to transform nature to survive, and that requires useful labor. Marx makes another important point about the relationship between labor and nature. The use values, coat, linen, and so on, that is, the bodies of commodities, are combinations of two elements, matter and labor. Everything we make combines natural materials with labor, and if we take away the useful labor expended upon them, a material substratum is always left, which is furnished by nature without the help of man. You can't create matter. Labor doesn't create the materials. It transforms them. As Marx puts it, the latter can work only as nature does, that is, by changing the form of matter. Labor changes the form of matter. It doesn't create matter from nothing. Nay, more, in this work of changing the form, he is constantly helped by natural forces. We use natural forces in our labor. Gravity, heat, chemical reactions. We harness nature to help us transform materials. Marx quotes William Petty with a memorable phrase. We see, then, that labor is not the only source of material wealth, of use values produced by labor. As William Petty puts it, labor is its father and the earth its mother. Labor and nature together create wealth. You need both. Now, Marx shifts gears. Let us now pass from the commodity considered as a use value to the value of commodities. We've been talking about useful labor and use values. Now we turn to value itself. Remember our example. The coat is worth twice as much as 10 yards of linen. Marx notes, by our assumption, the coat is worth twice as much as the linen. But this is a mere quantitative difference, which for the present does not concern us. We bear in mind, however, that if the value of the coat is double that of 10 yards of linen, 20 yards of linen must have the same value as one coat. So as values, one coat equals 20 yards of linen, and here's the key point. So far as they are values, the coat and the linen are things of a like substance, objective expressions of essentially identical labor. As values, they're the same kind of thing. They're both expressions of the same kind of labor. But wait. But tailoring and weaving are qualitatively different kinds of labor. Tailoring and weaving are different. We just established that. So how can they be expressions of identical labor? The same person, different tasks. Marx helps us see this with an example. There are, however, states of society in which one and the same man does tailoring and weaving alternately, in which case these two forms of labor are mere modifications of the labor of the same individual and not special and fixed functions of different persons. Imagine someone who makes a coat one day and weaves linen the next. It's the same person, the same labor power, just applied in different ways. Just as the coat which our tailor makes one day and the trousers which he makes another day imply only a variation in the labor of one and the same individual. And even in capitalism. Moreover, we see at a glance that in our capitalist society, a given portion of human labor is, in accordance with the varying demand, at one time supplied in the form of tailoring, at another in the form of weaving. Labor shifts between different activities based on demand. This change may possibly not take place without friction, but take place it must. Abstract human labor. Now, Marx gives us the crucial definition. Productive activity, if we leave out of sight its special form, that is, the useful character of the labor, is nothing but the expenditure of human labor power. If we ignore what specific kind of labor we're talking about, labor is just the expenditure of human labor power. That's it. Tailoring and weaving, though qualitatively different productive activities, are each a productive expenditure of human brains, nerves, and muscles, and in this sense are human labor. Whether you're tailoring or weaving, you're using your brain, your nerves, your muscles. You're expending human energy. They are but two different modes of expending human labor power. And then, but the value of a commodity represents human labor in the abstract, the expenditure of human labor in general. Value doesn't represent tailoring or weaving specifically. It represents abstract human labor. Labor in general, without regard to its specific form. Marx uses a social analogy. And just as in society, a general or a banker plays a great part, but mere man, on the other hand, a very shabby part, so here with mere human labor. In society, we notice generals and bankers. We don't notice mere humans. Similarly, with labor, we notice the specific forms, but value is about mere human labor, abstract labor. It is the expenditure of simple labor power, that is, of the labor power which, on an average, apart from any special development, exists in the organism of every ordinary individual. Simple, average labor power that anyone possesses. Not special skills, just ordinary human capacity to work. Skilled labor, reduced to simple labor. But what about skilled labor? What about work that requires training and expertise? Marx addresses this. Simple average labor, it is true, varies in character in different countries and at different times, but in a particular society it is given. Skilled labor counts only as simple labor intensified, or rather, as multiplied simple labor, a given quantity of skilled being considered equal to a greater quantity of simple labor. So skilled labor is just treated as a multiple of simple labor. 1 hour of skilled labor might count as 2 or 3 hours of simple labor. Experience shows that this reduction is constantly being made. A commodity may be the product of the most skilled labor, but its value, by equating it to the product of simple, unskilled labor, represents a definite quantity of the latter labor alone. No matter how skilled the labor, value ultimately gets expressed in terms of simple labor. How does this happen? The different proportions in which different sorts of labor are reduced to unskilled labor, as their standard are established by a social process that goes on behind the backs of the producers, and consequently appear to be fixed by custom. It happens through social processes, through the market, in ways that individual producers don't directly control. It just seems to be custom. Marx simplifies. For simplicity's sake, we shall henceforth account every kind of labor to be unskilled, simple labor. By this, we do no more than save ourselves the trouble of making the reduction. For the rest of the analysis, we'll just talk about simple labor and not worry about the conversion. Abstracting from useful forms. Now Marx brings it all together. Just as therefore in viewing the coat and linen as values we abstract from their different use values, so it is with the labor represented by those values. We disregard the difference between its useful forms, weaving and tailoring. When we think about value, we ignore the specific usefulness of products and the specific forms of labor. As the use values, coat and linen, are combinations of special productive activities with cloth and yarn, while the values, coat and linen, are, on the other hand, mere homogeneous conjugations of undifferentiated labor. So the labor embodied in these latter values does not count by virtue of its productive relation to cloth and yarn, but only as being expenditure of human labor power. The labor in value doesn't count because of what it specifically does. It counts simply as expenditure of human labor power. Tailoring and weaving are necessary factors in the creation of the use values coat and linen, precisely because these two kinds of labor are of different qualities. But only insofar as abstraction is made from their special qualities. Only insofar as both possess the same quality of being human labor do tailoring and weaving form the substance of the values of the same articles. For use value, labor must be qualitatively different. For value, labor must be treated as qualitatively the same as abstract human labor. Why the coat is worth twice as much, remember, we assumed the coat is worth twice as much as 10 yards of linen. Why? Coats and linen, however, are not merely values, but values of definite magnitude, and according to our assumption, the coat is worth twice as much as the 10 yards of linen. Whence this difference in their values? It is owing to the fact that the linen contains only half as much labor as the coat, and consequently, that in the production of the latter, labor power must have been expended during twice the time necessary for the production of the former. Simple. The coat takes twice as much labor time to produce. That's why it's worth twice as much. Quality versus quantity. Marx states the principle. While therefore, with reference to use value, the labor contained in a commodity counts only qualitatively, with reference to value it counts only quantitatively, and must first be reduced to human labor pure and simple. For use value, quality matters. What kind of labor is it? For value, quantity matters. How much labor? In the former case, it is a question of how and what, in the latter of how much. How long a time? Use value. How do you make it? What does it do? Value. How long does it take? Since the magnitude of the value of a commodity represents only the quantity of labor embodied in it, it follows that all commodities, when taken in certain proportions, must be equal in value. If commodities embody equal amounts of labor, they have equal value. It's that straightforward. When production changes, Marx explores what happens when productivity changes. If the productive power of all the different sorts of useful labor required for the production of a coat remains unchanged, the sum of the values of the coats produced increases with their number. If one coat represents X days' labor, 2 coats represent 2X days' labor, and so on. If nothing changes, making more coats means more total value. Makes sense. But assume that the duration of the labor necessary for the production of a coat becomes doubled or halved. In the first case, 1 coat is worth as much as 2 coats were before. In the second case, 2 coats are only worth as much as 1 was before, although in both cases, 1 coat renders the same service as before, and the useful labor embodied in it remains of the same quality. This is crucial. If it takes twice as long to make a coat, 1 coat becomes worth as much as 2 used to be. If it takes half as long, 2 coats are worth what 1 used to be. But the coat itself, it's still just as useful. It does the same thing. Only the value has changed. Material wealth versus value. Here's where Marx reveals something paradoxical. An increase in the quantity of use values is an increase of material wealth. With 2 coats, 2 men can be clothed. With 1 coat, only 1 man. More coats mean more material wealth. More people can be clothed, that's obvious. Nevertheless, an increased quantity of material wealth may correspond to a simultaneous fall in the magnitude of its value. Wait, you can have more material wealth but less value. How? This antagonistic movement has its origin in the twofold character of labor. It comes from the fact that labor has these 2 aspects: concrete useful labor and abstract labor. Productive power and use values. Marx explains, productive power has reference, of course, only to labor of some useful concrete form, the efficacy of any special productive activity during a given time being dependent on its productiveness. Productive power is about how much useful stuff you can make in a given time. Useful labor becomes, therefore, a more or less abundant source of products in proportion to the rise or fall of its productiveness. If productivity rises, you get more products from the same amount of labor. Productive power and value. But here's the key. On the other hand, no change in this productiveness affects the labor represented by value. Changes in productivity don't affect the value created per unit of time. Why not? Since productive power is an attribute of the concrete useful forms of labor, of course, it can no longer have any bearing on that labor. So soon as we make abstraction from those concrete useful forms, productive power is about specific kinds of labor doing specific things. But value is about abstract labor, labor in general, so productive power doesn't affect it. Marx states the principle precisely. However, then, productive power may vary. The same labor, exercised during equal periods of time, always yields equal amounts of value. No matter how productive you become, an hour of labor always creates the same amount of value. But it will yield, during equal periods of time, different quantities of values in use. More if the productive power rise, fewer if it fall. Higher productivity means more use values per hour, but the same value per hour. So, the same change in productive power, which increases the fruitfulness of labor, and, in consequence, the quantity of use values produced by that labor, will diminish the total value of this increased quantity of use values, provided such change shorten the total labor time necessary for their production, and vice versa. If you double productivity, you produce twice as many things in the same time. But each thing now has half the value because it only takes half as long to make. The total value stays the same, but it's spread across more products. The final summary. Marx ends with a powerful summary. On the one hand, all labor is, speaking physiologically, an expenditure of human labor power, and in its character of identical abstract human labor, it creates and forms the value of commodities. All labor, physiologically, is expenditure of human energy. As abstract labor, it creates value. On the other hand, all labor is the expenditure of human labor power in a special form and with a definite aim. And in this, its character of concrete useful labor, it produces use values. All labor is also specific, concrete, aimed at particular goals. As concrete labor, it creates use values. What we've learned. This section has given us the pivot point of Marx's entire analysis, the twofold character of labor. Labor has two aspects. As concrete, useful labor, it creates use values through specific productive activities. Tailoring makes coats, weaving makes linen. This kind of labor is eternally necessary for human survival. We must always transform nature through specific productive activities. But labor also has another character. As abstract human labor, as the mere expenditure of human labor power without regard to its specific form, it creates value. When we think about value, we abstract from all the specific qualities of labor and treat it simply as human labor in general. For use value, the quality of labor matters. For value, only the quantity matters. How long does it take? And here's the paradox. Increased productivity means more material wealth but not more value. If you double productivity, you produce twice as many use values in the same time. But each use value has half the value because it takes half as long to make. The same labor time always creates the same amount of value, but it gets spread across more or fewer products depending on productivity. Understanding this twofold character of labor is essential for everything that follows in Marx's analysis. It's how he'll explain profit, exploitation, crises, and the dynamics of capitalist development. This is indeed the pivot on which his entire political economy turns.
Next, Episode 3. The form of value or exchange value. Join us in the next chapter as Marx's argument continues to unfold.
We've got some amazing content coming your way. Subscribe now so you're first in line for fresh insights and all the good stuff you won't want to miss.